the Sega CD only sold about 2.2 million units worldwide, a huge flop compared to the 30 million Sega Genesis systems out there. Why did it fail? Was it too expensive? Not enough games? Too much full-motion video? Maybe all of them. But I think it's more interesting to take a look back at 20 games that show why the Sega CD deserved a lot more success than it actually had. Ready or not, here we go. The Terminator on Sega CD was a clear graphical improvement over the cartridge version, even including actual movie footage in full motion video, though I have to say, it hasn't aged well at all. In my opinion, the real highlight here is the soundtrack. You simply couldn't achieve this level of audio quality without a CD. Gameplay-wise, it's an action platformer that may not have the tightest mechanics, but overall, it's still the best video game adaptation of the movie. Lords of Thunder takes the shoot-'em-up formula in a different direction, swapping the usual spaceships for a fantasy-inspired setting. This is actually a port of the original TurboGrafx CD version, which is definitely the superior one. But the game is so good that even a weaker adaptation is still a fantastic experience. In fact, it easily ranks among the very best shooters available on the Sega CD. Not every full-motion video game was mediocre. Sometimes, it actually made sense. Back in the 80s, several arcade machines were built entirely around interactive movies, where gameplay came down to pressing the right button at the right time or shooting at targets with a light gun. Sure, it wasn't very interactive, but if the animation was good, it more than made up for it. Great examples of this style are Dragon's Lair, Mad Dog McCree, and of course Road Avenger, which Sega wisely bundled with the Sega CD in my region. Another technical highlight of the Sega CD was its ability to do hardware sprite scaling. Jaguar XJ220 put that feature to great use, delivering a racing game that looked fantastic for the time. This was actually the very first Sega CD game I ever tried. I remember seeing it on display in a game store. I was really young, so I didn't understand much about technical specs, but I do remember thinking the graphics moved so smoothly, and the music sounded real. Those were its most impressive qualities. Still, even then, it wasn't enough to convince me to ask for the system. And every time I see this game, I can't help but wonder, why didn't Sega ever release Outrun on the Sega CD? After seeing Star Fox on the Super Nintendo, almost any other 3D shooter on 16-bit hardware felt underwhelming. But if you take a closer look at Soulstar, you'll notice some unique features that actually make it a pretty solid shooter. Some stages follow the usual on-rails formula, where your ship moves forward and you simply shoot enemies along the way. But in other stages, the gameplay shifts, giving you full control to move in all three dimensions. That created the real feeling of exploring a 3D world, something genuinely ahead of its time. And then there are stages where your ship transforms into a walking mech, changing both the controls and the combat strategy. This variety made the game stand out, keeping it from being as linear as many other shooters of that era. In this case, the graphics were pretty similar to the versions released on the Genesis and Super Nintendo. In fact, the most striking feature, the animations, were created using an 80s technique already seen in Prince of Persia, rotoscoping. Where the Sega CD version of Flashback really stood out was in the audio department. Not only was the music upgraded to full CD quality, but it also added something I consider very important for adventure games like this: digitized voice acting.
Welcome to New Washington, young man. Here's a map of the city which you may find useful.
Thank you.
And speaking of Princes of Persia, look who's here. As with other great game adaptations, the original Prince of Persia was already so good that even without major improvements, it was still a solid title for the system. You won't find many big differences compared to other versions, except for the Super Nintendo one, of course. One change here is the look of the protagonist. Instead of the white outfit, he wears colored clothes and a turban, just like in the Apple II version. Another difference is the addition of animated cutscenes with digitized voices. Other than that, it's basically the same game, but with the usual Sega CD upgrade, a much better CD quality soundtrack. This next one was only released in Japan and the United States, so many of us never knew about it back then. At the time, publishers believed RPGs wouldn't sell outside of Japan, which was a huge mistake. Bockful Mail could have easily boosted system sales in any region. It's a platformer at heart, but it mixes in RPG mechanics. You can choose your character's equipment, manage an inventory, adjust stats, and even switch between different playable characters with unique abilities. You might recognize the name from the Super Nintendo, but that version is a completely different game, more of a straight platformer. Here, the animated cutscenes with voice acting were really impressive for the time. Remember, this was before the 32-bit era, so consoles didn't usually have anything like this yet.
But they're about to learn of something stronger, the hard way.
Did it really make sense to release the same game on cartridge for the Genesis and on disc for the Sega CD? Maybe so, at least if the CD version added something unique to the experience. Mickey Mania on Sega CD is basically identical to the Genesis version, with the only difference being its CD quality soundtrack. Still, it's a fantastic Mickey Mouse platformer, so even with a minimal added value, this version is definitely a must-have for the system. Traveler's Tales really knew how to push the Genesis hardware to its limits. Just look at Toy Story or Sonic 3D Blast as other examples. What I don't quite understand is this. If Disney games were being released for both Genesis and Sega CD, why not bring over some of Sega's own classics? Or maybe this one. Well, on second thought, maybe not. So if releasing pretty much the same game on both Genesis and Sega CD didn't seem like enough, how about putting it out on the 32X as well? At least Pitfall did bring a few exclusive features to the Sega CD version. As usual, the soundtrack got the CD quality upgrade. It also included extra levels. These were also present on the 32X, but not on the Genesis cartridge. And on top of that, it featured full-motion video cutscenes. In other words, it actually took advantage of the system's technical strengths, adding real value to an already solid game. Using technology in a completely different way turned this shoot-'em-up into arguably the most visually spectacular game on the system. Sylphie delivers a 3D style experience where, interestingly enough, the only true polygons are the ships themselves. We're used to seeing pre-rendered graphics applied to character sprites, but here that technique was used for the stage backgrounds. Essentially, each level plays out over a full-motion video backdrop, with your ship moving on top of it. The gameplay itself is strictly two-dimensional, but sometimes it almost tricks you into thinking otherwise. Developed by GameArts, who, by the way, also created another completely different but equally outstanding Sega CD title we'll look at later. This was a game that simply couldn't have existed without the CD format. And those cinematic intro cutscenes, honestly, they're some of the best I've ever seen.
279 and 333. Take the vehicle into that mission. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill.
Echo the Dolphin was a big success when it first launched, with versions released across all of Sega's consoles, and even a sequel later on. These days, though, opinions are pretty divided. Some people absolutely love it, while others remain indifferent. Personally, I lean more toward the second group, but I still have to recognize its fantastic art direction and incredible originality. An underwater exploration and puzzle game starring a dolphin was both innovative and risky. In fact, I'd say that until Colibri on the 32X, also developed by Novatrade, we didn't really see anything quite like it. This Sega CD version is arguably the most complete one. Not only does it feature a CD quality soundtrack, which is even more important in a game set under the sea, but it also includes several exclusive levels. If we're talking about games that should have helped the Sega CD find more success back in the day, Robo LS is a solid example. It's a strong shoot-'em up from Compile, but beyond its CD quality soundtrack, it doesn't really take much advantage of the system's technical features. The main reason it deserves a spot here is that it's the sequel to a hugely successful Genesis game, Musha. In other words, fans of that title who wanted to play the follow-up had no choice but to do it on the Sega CD. The problem was that the original was so good, this one ended up feeling worse than it actually was. In a way, being the sequel to such a classic worked against it instead of boosting its popularity. And just a personal note, the whole idea of a shooter starring a mecha set in feudal Japan? I think that's pure genius. I have to admit, for those of us who owned a Sega console back when Final Fight came out on the Super Nintendo, there was a little bit of envy. But when this version arrived on the Sega CD, I think the tables turned, because this is the most complete port of the game. It includes all 3 of the original playable characters. On the SNES version, Guy was missing, and he was only later added in a rental-only edition that replaced Cody. On Sega CD, they were all here. Plus, it supported 2-player co-op, hands down the best way to enjoy a beat-em-up. The game also featured all 6 stages from the arcade, including this industrial area that was cut from the Super Nintendo version. And to top it off, it added a few extra features: a time attack mode, difficulty selection, small animated cutscenes with digitized voices, and of course, CD quality music. When does a shooter become a simulator? In my opinion, it happens when there's a real attempt to convey realism. That's why AH3 Thunderstrike can be considered a true combat simulator, at least within the hardware limitations of the time. The cockpit view, the radar marking enemy targets, the map, the altitude indicator, and even the compass all help create that sense of authenticity. The graphics added to the immersion as well. Flying a helicopter through landscapes that, thanks to hardware scaling, gave a strong sense of three-dimensionality.
Bank right. You're off course.
It was a tough genre to pull off convincingly on 16-bit consoles, but in this case, it worked, and it paid off. In fact, Thunderstrike became the best-selling Sega CD game in the UK. We kick off the top 5 with a game from a genre that wasn't nearly as prominent on Sega's consoles as it was on the Super Nintendo, turn-based RPGs. And this won't be the only one we'll see on this list. Shining Force CD is one of those games that really should have helped the Sega CD find more success. It's actually a remake of Shining Force Gaiden, which never left Japan. And its sequel, later released outside Japan under the title The Sword of Hajin. So, for fans of the 2 Genesis entries, the Sega CD offered the chance to enjoy even more shining force action, and it was exclusive to the system. Unfortunately, it went mostly unnoticed at the time, but over the years, it has gained cult status and is now regarded as one of the very best games on the Sega CD. If you're familiar with Hideo Kojima's games, you've probably noticed the cinematic style that defines them. His more recent titles even feature Hollywood actors. You could say that this way of making games actually began here with Snatcher. Even back then, Kojima was already showing his unique vision, and you might even notice that the protagonist feels straight out of a movie. I'm a huge Kojima fan, and maybe that's why I admire how he brings video games closer to cinema, elevating them to another level. The Sega CD version is widely considered the best. It offered some graphical improvements, toned down censorship, and, most importantly, if you didn't speak Japanese, this was the very first time the game was translated into English. With such a deep story and endless dialogue, that was absolutely essential. It didn't sell much, but that doesn't change the fact. Snatcher is one of the greatest games on the Sega CD.
Was that supposed to be? If you were a better junker than that, Jean wouldn't have had to die out there.
Does the success of a console depend on its exclusive titles? Well, not entirely, but they certainly play a big part. For example, I bought a PlayStation just so I could play Metal Gear Solid and Gran Turismo 2. That's why the top 3 here are Sega CD exclusives. Or at least, that's how I should explain this first case. Earthworm Jim is far from exclusive to the Sega CD. It was released on practically every console. But if you wanted to play the definitive version of this game, that was exclusive to the Sega CD. This special edition came out a year after the Genesis version, and it became the foundation for future improvements. Among them, a brand new CD quality soundtrack. Some people used to say Sega CD games were just Genesis titles with CD music. I completely disagree. Back in the early 90s, hearing music of that quality in a video game could surprise you just as much as seeing 3D graphics. Enhanced animations, which were already excellent. You can clearly see the influence of David Perry's work on Aladdin for the Genesis. A password system to save your progress, and 3 different endings depending on the difficulty level. And perhaps the most important addition, not only expanded stages with new areas, but an entirely new exclusive level. Could you really ask for more? And the answer is Sonic. I honestly believe the Sega CD deserved more success than it got, but at the same time, I also think the Sonic game went under the radar for many players precisely because of the system it was released on. It actually improves upon the masterpiece that was Sonic the Hedgehog 2 on the Genesis in several ways. The soundtrack. Obviously, being on CD, the audio quality is superb. Interestingly, the US version had a completely different soundtrack than the rest of the world, something that wasn't too well received, since the original score is just fantastic. Graphically, the standard levels don't really push the Sega CD's unique features, but then you get to the bonus stages, absolutely mind-blowing, with a style that feels very reminiscent of Mario Kart. And thanks to the Sega CD's full motion video capabilities, The game features an incredible animated intro created by Toei Animation. Gameplay-wise, it introduced the time travel mechanic, which was generally very well received and, to this day, hasn't really been revisited in another Sonic game. When you travel to the future, you'll see a dark, robot-filled world where Dr. Robotnik has already won. To prevent that, you need to go back to the past and change history. There are also some fun little details. This game marked the very first appearance of Amy and Metal Sonic. But if Sonic is only number 2, then which game should have been the one to make the Sega CD truly successful? This should have been the game that made everyone remember the Sega CD as a great console, not as a failure. And it's not just about sales figures, though it's worth mentioning that Lunar, the Silver Star, sold incredibly well both in Japan and overseas. It's more about the fact that a game this outstanding in every single aspect should be the very first thing people think of when they hear Sega CD, not questionable titles like Night Trap. Maybe its biggest handicap was that it was a turn-based JRPG, presented in full 2D at a time when the gaming world was already craving 3D experiences. But that, honestly, is a huge injustice. For a 1992 release, its graphics were beautiful, fully animated, and bursting with personality. It was the best-selling game for Sega CD in Japan, later translated into English, where it became the second best-selling title worldwide. And yet, outside of specialized gaming press, the general memory of Sega CD is of an overpriced system with a small library of mediocre full-motion video games, not as the console where the Luna Saga was born. By the way, its sequel, also exclusive to Sega CD, is every bit as good as this one. And here's the thing. I sometimes wonder if someone inside Sega wanted the Sega CD to go down in history as a failure. Because when the Sega Genesis Mini 2 was released not long ago, it included some Sega CD titles. That would have been the perfect chance to show the world the true quality of the system's library. In Japan, the mini console included the Lunar games. But in the rest of the world, they gave us the fucking Night Trap instead. And that's it for this ranking of games that really should have made the Sega CD a successful console, or at least a successful add-on. I hope this video gave you the urge to try out some of these amazing titles, and if you've got more suggestions, please leave them on a comment down below. Before I go, just a quick reminder, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe if you're into classic gaming, and hit that bell so YouTube lets you know when my next video goes live, which will be very soon. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.